The sun scorched the Nile Valley like a divine eye watching every sin below. Its rays poured down over endless fields of grain, flickered across towering obelisks, and finally crashed upon the limestone bones of the pyramids, colossal tombs built by hands that trembled with agony, not devotion. Beneath this golden sky, a silent war was waged, not with swords, but with whip and chain. You could hear it in the distant scream muffled by desert wind. You could see it in the blood that stained the tools of Pharaoh's will. Slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't merely servitude. It was survival through obedience or death through resistance. And in this world, shaped by gods who wore crowns and walked among men, cruelty wasn't the exception. It was divine order. What happens when absolute power rules by divine right, when men believe they are gods and slaves are less than insects beneath their feet? Welcome to Egypt, land of pyramids and pits of punishment. To understand the horror of how Egyptian pharaohs punished their slaves, we must first grasp the world they created, a civilization of staggering splendor, built on the backs of human lives. Ancient Egypt, spanning over 3,000 years of dynastic rule, was a theocratic monarchy where pharaohs reigned not just as kings, but as living deities. They were seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky, and upon death they ascended to become one with Osiris, lord of the underworld. This wasn't just symbolic. It had consequences. Divine power granted pharaohs an unchecked license to rule, command, and punish with impunity. Their word was law, their anger, apocalypse. Society beneath them was layered like the bricks in a pyramid. At the base, millions of peasants and slaves toiled endlessly, anonymous in life and forgotten in death. Egypt's economy, its temples, its cities, even its ideology, were built on forced labor. Slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't racially defined, but situational. War captives, criminals, debtors, and even entire villages conquered by Pharaoh's armies could be enslaved. Some worked in households as servants. Others were leased to temples or state-run workshops. But the most grueling, the most brutal, were those forced into state labor. These were the nameless who dug canals, built palaces, dragged stone across desert sands to raise temples that kissed the heavens. Under the whip, they laid every cornerstone of Egypt's glory. And for many, that whip was only the beginning. Though the image of the whip has become an overused symbol of slavery, its reality in ancient Egypt was far worse. Whipping was not punishment, it was a way of life. The scourge, a braided leather scourge, was so common that taskmasters wore it like a badge. Overseers, often armed with staffs, kept watch over teams of slaves like hawks watching prey. The ancient Egyptian word for overseer of laborers was im-kat, literally meaning he who is over the work. But in practice it meant he who controls your pain. Pharaohs were obsessed with maintaining order mat, the divine balance of the cosmos. Any disruption to this order, laziness, theft, escape, was seen as rebellion against the gods themselves. And the punishment wasn't correction, it was spectacle. Inscriptions from tombs and temples record grim details. One supervisor named Horemheb issued an edict during the 18th dynasty, declaring that any worker caught fleeing his assigned duties would be beaten with 100 blows, opened in the skin, and returned to his post. That phrase, opened in the skin, was not metaphor. Flogging often tore flesh from muscle, exposing bones. There were no doctors, no mercy, only the expectation to resume work. But even the lash was merciful compared to what waited in the darker chambers of Pharaoh's domain. There were no formal prisons in ancient Egypt as we think of them. Instead, punishment was immediate, public, and brutal, designed not to rehabilitate, but to terrify. Torture was not regulated by law, but by the pharaoh's will. And for slaves, especially those caught stealing from temples or attempting escape, the consequences were horrifying. One of the most feared punishments was mutilation. Ears were cut off, noses sliced, tongues ripped from mouths. These were not just punishments, but warnings, permanent disfigurement to mark the body as criminal. In the village of Deir el-Medina, which housed workers building the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, Archaeological records show evidence of hands severed and skulls with blunt force trauma, signs of punishment too severe to survive. More gruesome still was branding. Slaves caught trying to flee were burned with hot irons. Some were marked on the forehead with the name of their owner or a symbol of their crime, a permanent, searing humiliation. Imagine the hiss of red-hot copper pressing into soft flesh, the scream echoing across desert stone, and all the while the overseer watching, unmoved. And then there was execution. The Egyptians believed the body was sacred. It had to be preserved in death for the soul to find peace in the afterlife. That belief extended to everyone except those who challenged Pharaoh's will. Slaves executed for crimes were denied burial rights. Their corpses were thrown to the desert, left for jackals and vultures. In rare, extreme cases, particularly during periods of heightened paranoia or rebellion, the punishments escalated into ritual torture and spectacle. Historical fragments suggest that rebellious slaves were sometimes buried alive. Others were impaled, their bodies left as warnings on the roadways leading to Thebes or Memphis. The scribes recorded everything. They didn't flinch. To them, these were not atrocities. They were acts of cosmic justice. The gods had to be appeased, the Pharaoh's order had to be preserved, and the slaves, they were just the cost of eternity. And yet, among the silence of the tombs and the grandeur of the monuments, you can still feel it, the whisper of those who suffered. Every massive stone hauled across burning sand echoes with the grunts and cries of thousands who would never be named. Every hieroglyph praising the glory of a pharaoh is stained with the pain of backs whipped raw beneath a merciless sun. This was a world that believed in order above all else, and where that order cracked, punishment rushed in like floodwaters. But the horror did not end there. As dynasties rose and fell, and pharaohs grew paranoid of rebellion from within, punishment evolved. It became more elaborate, more symbolic, more theatrical. And some pharaohs, they reveled in it. In the next part, we delve into the age of empire and rebellion, where fear ruled the palace, slaves became scapegoats for unrest, and one pharaoh's rise to power ignited a wave of cruelty that shook even the gods. The Nile gave life, but it also carried whispers of rebellion. For centuries, the pharaohs ruled with divine authority, their words etched in stone, their images carved into the faces of mountains. But behind the facade of order and divinity, the empire seethed. Egypt's enemies were not always foreign invaders. Sometimes they came from within, from the mines, from the quarries, from the very workers who laid the golden bricks of immortality. And in times of unrest, pharaohs did not hesitate. They punished not with justice, but with fear. As the New Kingdom rose, around 1550 BCE, Egypt reached the height of its power. It expanded into Nubia, conquered parts of the Levant, and amassed more wealth than ever before. But with that wealth came paranoia. Pharaohs now commanded vast territories and enormous building projects, temples that swallowed entire villages, tombs dug deep into mountains, colossal statues towering like silent gods. And these works demanded bodies, thousands of them. The machine of empire consumed slaves like grain, and when the machine faltered, when slaves resisted, or even when the mere rumor of rebellion reached Pharaoh's ears, the response was not political, it was punitive. One of the most telling examples comes from the reign of Seti I, father of the legendary Rameses the Great. Seti was a builder king, erecting temples and monuments across the land. His workers included free men, conscripted laborers, and slaves, many of them war captives from Nubia and Canaan. The records from this period, particularly in Thebes and Karnak, show signs of increasing unrest, granary thefts, delayed payments, tools deliberately sabotaged. And in one instance, entire work crews mysteriously disappeared from the official accounts. The scribes never explained why. But archaeologists found the answer: a mass grave of broken skeletons just outside the main quarry site. No burial rites, no inscriptions, bones showing signs of blunt trauma and burn marks. A message carved into silence. But it wasn't only physical resistance pharaohs feared. It was spiritual rebellion. You see, pharaohs ruled not only through force but through myth. They were the guardians of Ma'at, cosmic balance. Any disruption, even minor insubordination, was seen as a crack in that divine order. And to patch that crack, they resorted to public rituals of punishment ceremonies designed not just to destroy the body of the guilty, but to terrorize the hearts of the loyal. Ramesses II, the great builder, left behind temples of staggering grandeur: Abu Simbel, Luxor, the Ramesseum. But behind these monuments of glory lies another truth. Ramesses presided over one of the most intensely disciplined labor regimes in Egyptian history. He waged constant war. Each campaign brought back prisoners: Libyans, Hittites, Shasu nomads, all turned into state property, slaves. Many were sent to labor on his temple complexes, where the demands were unrelenting. At the height of his reign, Egypt faced a drought. Crops failed, grain became scarce, tensions rose. It was in this moment of crisis that an incident occurred in Deir el-Medina, a small elite village housing royal tomb artisans. The workers there, though not slaves, lived under strict state control. When their grain rations were delayed due to the drought, they did the unthinkable. They stopped working. It was, in essence, Egypt's first recorded labor strike. This event terrified the ruling elite. If state-controlled artisans could defy Pharaoh, what might the slaves do? What rebellions brewed beneath the silent faces of the pyramids? The response was swift and brutal. Although the artisans' protest was eventually resolved with negotiation, the incident triggered a wave of inspections, purges, and punishment across other work camps. In less privileged areas, particularly among slave laborers, the retribution was absolute. Pharaohs began to rely heavily on an ancient institution, the Medjay. Originally Nubian nomads, the Medjay were absorbed into the Egyptian system as desert scouts and enforcers. By the New Kingdom, they had become an elite paramilitary police force. Their job? Control the laborers, guard the tombs, enforce the pharaoh's will without question. They patrolled the Valley of the Kings, the quarries at Aswan, and the gold mines in the eastern desert, hellish places where men were worked until they dropped. In these mines, conditions were worse than death. Slaves were forced to dig narrow shafts in suffocating heat, chained together, whipped constantly. There was no water, only rationed beer. Escape was impossible. Those who tried were hunted by Medjay trackers across the barren wastes. If captured, the punishment was extreme. Some were blinded, their eyes gouged out with bronze hooks. Others had their feet crushed, bones shattered with stone mallets, so they could never run again. Branding was common, sometimes accompanied by castration. These acts were not hidden. They were performed in front of other workers, a macabre warning. Disobedience leads to disfigurement. In the age of Ramesses III, the empire began to crack. Foreign invasions, corruption, and internal conspiracy shook the throne. The famous Harem conspiracy revealed that even within the palace, betrayal festered. One of Ramesses' wives and several high-ranking officials plotted to assassinate him and replace him with her son. When the plot was uncovered, the trials were swift. But among the many punished were not just nobles. Dozens of servants and slaves were implicated. Some had been messengers, others simply witnesses. All were tortured for information. The most common method? Beating the soles of the feet until the victim collapsed in agony, a technique designed to inflict maximum pain without immediate death. The official papyrus records speak of interrogation with fire. Some historians interpret this as branding or burning with hot irons. Others suggest the use of heated metal tools inserted under fingernails or applied to genitals. What is certain is this: none of the slaves involved survived. They were executed by drowning, throat-slitting, or forced suicide. Their bodies were never embalmed, their names erased. As Egypt declined, pharaohs grew more erratic. Power fractured. Foreign rulers, Libyans, Nubians, Persians, began to occupy the throne. But the culture of punishment remained deeply ingrained. Even in the late period, as Greek mercenaries and Persian satraps roamed Egyptian lands, slaves remained vital and expendable. In the Temple of Hybis in the Karga Oasis, one inscription from the Persian occupation describes a public execution of 33 foreign slaves who allegedly plotted to poison a governor. Their punishment was crucifixion, bodies nailed to palm trees lining the road, left to rot under the desert sun. This was not a traditional Egyptian practice, suggesting foreign influence. But the intent was unmistakable: fear, spectacle, deterrence. Even after centuries of change, the cycle endured: rebellion, retribution, repression. The Egyptian empire was a paradox. It revered life, yet sacrificed thousands. It worshipped order, yet enforced it through chaos. It celebrated the beauty of creation while perfecting the art of destruction. And at the heart of it all stood the Pharaoh, living God, architect of both miracles and nightmares. In the next part, we turn our eyes to a single horrifying moment, one that unfolded at the peak of Egypt's paranoia: a slave accused of sedition, a temple court darkened for ritual judgment, and a punishment so cruel it became legend. We enter the chamber, the crowd gathers, and the execution begins. It began with a whisper in the shadows of a temple wall, a whisper that a slave had stolen from the sacred storerooms of the Temple of Karnak, not food, not coin, but scrolls. Papyrus meant only for priestly hands, words of ritual and power guarded for generations. To the common Egyptian, this was sacrilege. To the priests, it was treason. To the pharaoh, it was an affront to the gods themselves. And so, from that moment, the fate of one slave was sealed. His name would never be recorded. His deeds would be struck from memory. But his punishment would be carved in fear. What follows is the reconstruction of a punishment so severe, so orchestrated in its brutality, that it served as a message for generations. A warning, not just to slaves, but to all who dared challenge the divine order. It was the 20th dynasty, the reign of Ramesses XI, a time of instability, famine, and growing unrest. The once mighty empire was beginning to decay. The priests of Amun had grown as powerful as the pharaoh himself, and Karnak, the largest temple complex in Egypt, had become a fortress of political and religious authority. The priesthood controlled land, food, wealth, and fear. When rumors spread that a temple slave had broken into the restricted archive chambers and stolen papyri that outlined funerary rites and divine formulas, outrage surged like a sandstorm through the priestly elite. This wasn't a simple theft. These scrolls were the voice of the gods. They held spells to open the gates of the afterlife, rituals to guide the dead through the underworld. In the wrong hands, they were believed to cause disaster, famine, death, chaos. Whether the slave acted out of desperation, defiance, or simple curiosity no longer mattered. What mattered now was vengeance. The priests petitioned the pharaoh for judgment. Ramesses XI, already under pressure from a crumbling court and rising insurrections in the south, could not afford leniency. He approved the trial, and worse, he allowed it to be public. A performance of divine punishment. The trial was held not in a court, but within the shadowed hypostyle hall of Karnak itself. Colossal pillars towered like stone judges. Incense filled the air, masking the stench of sweat and fear. The accused slave, bound at the wrists and ankles, was dragged before a tribunal of priests and scribes. His eyes were swollen, his lips cracked. For days, he had been denied water. The interrogation had already begun in secret beatings, sleep deprivation, dislocation of joints by binding him in contorted positions. Now, it was time to complete the ritual of punishment. The head priest, draped in leopard skin and adorned with a gold mask, read the charges in a voice that echoed like thunder beneath the sandstone ceiling. The punishment, he declared, would be administered in 5 phases, each corresponding to an offense against the gods. The first phase would begin at sunrise. The public would gather in the courtyard. The gods would be watching. As the first rays of morning light pierced the gates of Karnak, drums began to beat, slow, rhythmic, foreboding. Crowds gathered: workers, soldiers, fellow slaves, even children perched on shoulders, watching, learning, dreading. The condemned was brought forward, his legs barely holding his weight. He had not slept in 3 nights. His body shook from fever, from pain, or from knowing what was to come. He was chained to a wooden platform in the temple's outer courtyard, surrounded by guards and Medjay enforcers. His arms were stretched above his head and fastened to a crossbar. The executioner's two men masked in linen carried staffs tipped with bronze. The first punishment, flaying by beating. Each blow was delivered across the back, chest, and thighs with surgical cruelty. The staff tips had small barbs, meant not only to bruise but to tear, flesh split like overripe fruit. With every crack, the crowd flinched, yet they did not turn away. Priests chanted over the spectacle. Each phrase invoked a god wronged by the slave's defilement. For Amun we tear the skin, for Thoth we break the word, for Osiris we desecrate the vessel. The second phase followed immediately, salt and sand. The executioners smeared coarse desert salt mixed with crushed limestone across the open wounds. The mixture bit into exposed nerves like fire ants under the skin. The man screamed. His scream echoed into the vaults of Karnak and rose into the sky. Some in the crowd turned away. Others watched, stone-faced. This was not entertainment. This was education. But this punishment was not only about pain, it was about ritual, about symbolism. The third phase took place within the temple's purification pool. His battered body was dragged to the sacred water not to cleanse, but to desecrate. The priests declared him impure among the living, unfit for the afterlife. He was submerged, held under until his lungs screamed for air, then lifted, then submerged again. This was not execution. This was spiritual drowning, a ritual meant to sever the soul's link to eternity. His eyes were bloodshot, his body convulsed, but he lived. And so, the fourth phase could proceed. The fourth punishment was known among temple enforcers as the silencing. A bronze awl, heated over flame, was brought forth. Its tip glowed red. Two men held the slave down, while a third pried open his mouth. The awl was inserted beneath the tongue and twisted. The scream that followed was muffled by blood. He would never speak again. But the priests had no intention of letting him die just yet. As the sun began to fall, the final act was prepared, the fifth phase, abandonment. He was placed inside a sealed chamber, not a tomb, but an empty stone room beneath the temple floor. No light, no food, no water, just heat, pain, and time. This was punishment by divine silence. The gods would decide if he lived or died. The priests had finished their work. He was found 2 days later, curled into himself like a shriveled animal, still breathing somehow. His body was covered in flies, his eyes milky, his wounds infected. A decision was made not by Pharaoh, not by the gods, but by the high priest. He would not be executed. He would be paraded. His broken body was loaded onto a cart and pulled through the workers' district, his tongue split, his skin blackened by rot, a warning carved into his chest in ink and fire. I defied the gods. He would never again speak, never walk, but he would be seen, a living corpse, a message with breath. For years, temple slaves whispered his story. Some called him cursed. Others believed he had tried to learn the secrets of the afterlife, and the gods had punished him for seeking their power. But all agreed on one thing: no one would ever try again. The story of the punishment spread beyond Karnak, to Memphis, to Abydos, to Thebes, and every time it was told, the darkness deepened, because this was more than cruelty. It was ceremony, a sacred performance of terror, and it worked. But this was only one act in a theater of thousands. In the next part, we descend fully into the most brutal corners of Egypt's cruelty. We witness the full sequence of a public torture execution from sunrise to blood-soaked dusk. Not ritual, not symbolic, but raw, methodical, almost industrial violence. The gods would demand pain, and Pharaoh would deliver. The sun rose over Thebes like a blade drawn from its scabbard, sharp, brilliant, and merciless. The day would be hot. The air already carried the scent of dust, sweat, and the coppery hint of blood. Birds circled above the temple walls, waiting. In the marketplace, voices were hushed. Children clung to their mothers. Even seasoned soldiers walked with their heads down. For today, the Pharaoh had ordered an execution, not behind closed doors, not in the shadows. Today would be public, and the condemned, a slave from Nubia, would be made into a lesson no one would forget. His crime was clear: attempting to murder his overseer. Witnesses said he crept into the man's quarters with a stone blade stolen from a stonemason. He was caught before the strike, tackled, beaten, and dragged away screaming. But even the attempt was unforgivable. The pharaoh's decree was swift: death by multi-stage execution. It would take hours. That was the point. Not just to punish, to perform. As the courtyard near the Temple of Luxor filled, a wooden scaffold had already been erected in the square. It wasn't tall, just enough to elevate the condemned above the crowd. Ropes dangled from its beams like snakes waiting to strike. A basin was carved into the earth below to catch the blood. Around the edges, soldiers formed a ring. Behind them, priests in white linen chanted low prayers to Maat and Horus. Incense smoldered, but its sweetness could not mask the rising stench of fear and anticipation. Then came the drum, a single beat, slow and deliberate. The crowd turned. The prisoner approached. He was dragged forward, barefoot, ankles bound, hands tied behind his back. He was shirtless. His back was already marked with lashes, early punishment to soften him for the spectacle. His head hung low, but his eyes still burned. That would not do. The first phase began immediately: public display and humiliation. He was forced to his knees in front of the crowd. A priest stood above him and read his crimes aloud. He raised his hand against a servant of Pharaoh. He lifted the blade against the ordained order. He has defied the will of the gods. With each line, the crowd was instructed to spit. Some obeyed. Others turned their heads. Even among enemies of the state, this display was cruel. Children cried. Women wept quietly. But the men on the scaffold prepared the tools. They had no such emotion. Phase 2, the stripping of flesh. He was bound to a vertical frame at the center of the scaffold, arms stretched wide, legs spread. 2 executioners, masked and silent, stepped forward. They carried thin, curved knives, bronze, recently sharpened. Beginning at his back, they made shallow cuts along the spine, tracing ribs, slicing skin from muscle in slow, deliberate motions. The man screamed, not once, but over and over. It echoed between the columns of the temple and bounced down the alleyways beyond. Blood ran like paint down his legs. His body shook with agony, but the ropes held him fast. When he nearly lost consciousness, one of the priests dabbed crushed myrrh and vinegar beneath his nose. He awoke to more pain. This was the pharaoh's justice. A body opened like parchment, read aloud in blood. Phase 3, the breaking of limbs. Wooden mallets, heavy, dark, worn smooth from years of use. The executioners moved to the slave's knees. One blow, then another. Bone cracked, flesh collapsed inward. The man screamed again, higher, more primal. They moved to his elbows. Another 2 strikes, each followed by a pause, a silence, then a cheer, encouraged by the guards. Some in the crowd had left by now, vomited, fainted, but those who remained, soldiers, overseers, enforcers, watched with approval. This was discipline, made manifest, but it was far from over. Phase 4, the fire ritual. Charcoal braziers were brought forward, placed on either side of the scaffold. Iron rods were inserted, their tips glowing orange within minutes. 2 guards approached the prisoner, who now sagged in his bonds, unable to scream anymore. The hot irons were pressed into his thighs first, then his stomach. Finally, one was placed under his jaw, searing the flesh upward toward the tongue. The smell of burning meat overpowered the incense. Even the priests stepped back. The man twitched, convulsed, moaned through blood and ruin. His eyes were open but unseeing. He was no longer fully there, but his body clung to life. That was necessary for the final act. Phase 5, death by red drowning. The priest raised a copper blade and called upon the gods. Osiris, Lord of Judgment; Maat, Keeper of Balance; Anubis, Guide of the Dead. As he chanted, 2 guards raised the slave by his shoulders and dragged him forward. The blood basin had filled over the hours. His own blood, mixed now with wine and oil, it shimmered in the fading sun. They submerged his head, held it there. 10 seconds. 20. He flailed once. Then silence. They held him still. When his body finally stopped moving, the priest declared, The gods have accepted the offering. The crowd, what remained of it, knelt, not out of reverence, out of fear. The body was hoisted, displayed one last time, then removed not for burial but for exposure. It would be left outside the workers' camp for 3 days. Flies would gather, dogs would circle. Everyone would see. Everyone would remember. The pharaoh's message was clear. In his empire, rebellion would not be hidden. It would be displayed, not just killed, disassembled. The execution became legend among the slave communities. Mothers warned their sons. Overseers whispered the details like a prayer. Some said the soul of the man still screamed in the temple courtyard at night. Others believed he had been reborn, not in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, but in Duat, the underworld of chaos. Either way, his fate achieved its purpose. There were no more attacks on overseers that year, nor the next. And the pharaoh, though aging and paranoid, believed balance had been restored. But punishment has consequences. The more pain inflicted, the more resentment festers. For every public display of violence, another voice vanished into silence. But silence does not mean peace. It only means waiting. In our final part, we look at what came after, how these punishments echoed beyond the reigns of pharaohs, shaped uprisings, reshaped dynasties, and how the legacy of fear continues to haunt the bones of Egypt. Long after the drums stopped, long after the cries faded into the sandstone walls, and long after the last drop of blood soaked into the sun-hardened earth, the fear remained. Not in the palaces, not in the temples, but in the people. The legacy of Egyptian slave punishment was not written solely in scrolls or etched onto temple columns. It was written into memory, passed down through stories, fears, silences. Beneath the grandeur of obelisks and the towering majesty of Karnak and Luxor, a darker truth loomed, one whispered, never shouted. The pharaohs ruled not just by divine right, but by terror. As the new kingdom gave way to chaos, Egypt's golden mask began to crack. The empire that once stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Nubia began to fracture under its own weight. The abuse of power, the brutal punishment of slaves, workers, even nobles had bought decades of control, but not stability. By the time of the 21st dynasty, tomb robbing became widespread, not by foreign invaders, but by Egyptians themselves. Priests, guards, slaves, even members of the royal workforce at Deir el-Medina. The same artisans who once carved sacred hieroglyphs were now chiseling open the tombs of long-dead kings to steal gold and sacred artifacts. Why? Because faith was crumbling. The fear that once held men in check no longer inspired awe. It inspired hatred, desperation, resentment. And behind that resentment was the memory of cruelty. The punishments endured by generations of slaves, the flayings, brandings, drownings, and mutilations, were never just about crime. They were about control, about a state system designed to squeeze labor from the human body until there was nothing left but bone and breathless dust. That system didn't disappear with a dynasty. It metastasized. When the Persians conquered Egypt in the 6th century BCE, they adopted many of Egypt's administrative systems, including forced labor. But they brought with them even harsher methods of execution: impalement, crucifixion, mass public torture. Slaves under Persian rule were punished both for rebellion and for being reminders of the pharaoh's failed order. Then came Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies, the Romans, and with each new ruler, Egypt's brutal legacy was not erased. It was copied, adapted, evolved. During the Ptolemaic period, under Greek rule, the treatment of Egyptian slaves became even more industrialized. The temples of Isis and Serapis grew rich on the backs of thousands who labored in salt mines, quarries, and shipyards under unbearable conditions. Greek and Egyptian overseers alike used punishment as discipline, continuing a 2,000-year-old tradition. By then, the ancient gods had changed, but the pain remained the same. Slaves were still branded, still dismembered, still executed in public arenas. In fact, with the spread of Hellenistic culture, public torture became more theatrical, with audiences cheering as offenders were ripped apart by wild animals or burned alive before altars. In the Roman period, Egyptian slaves were shipped to other parts of the empire. Many ended up in Italy, Gaul, and Asia Minor, but they brought with them the knowledge of Egyptian servitude, the legacy of god-kings who had used divine fear as a weapon. It infected the empire like a virus. Rome, already familiar with crucifixion, refined it to an art. Egypt had laid the foundation, Rome built upon it. But punishment does not preserve empires. It corrodes them. What the pharaohs failed to realize was this: the more they beat the bodies of their slaves, the more they weakened the soul of their nation. Every public execution created 10 more rebels in secret. Every mutilated corpse carved a scar into the collective memory of the people. The empire that rose on fear could not sustain hope, and without hope, even pyramids crumble. By the time of the final dynasties, Egypt had become a land of occupied silence. Its monuments loomed like ghosts, symbols of power long dead. The pharaohs were no longer seen as gods, but as tyrants who bled the land dry. Their tombs were looted, their names erased. Even the great tomb of Ramesses II, once the most powerful man in the known world, was stripped bare by thieves. His mummified body, discovered thousands of years later, was found not in a grand sarcophagus, but hidden in a cache with other discarded royals, as if the gods themselves had turned their backs. And yet, even in ruin, their cruelty echoed forward. When 19th century explorers uncovered tombs and monuments, they marveled at the artistry, but they rarely asked, who built these? What did it cost? Only in the 20th and 21st centuries did Egyptologists begin to study the lives of ordinary workers and slaves, those whose blood, sweat, and agony forged the temples and pyramids. What they found was chilling. Skeletons unearthed at pyramid sites showed signs of severe arthritis, stress fractures, and disfigurement, all consistent with overwork and corporal punishment. Some bore evidence of fatal injuries: crushed skulls, snapped ribs, ligature marks on ankles and wrists. These were not soldiers, not nobles. These were laborers, servants, slaves. Their suffering had been buried, both literally and historically. Until now. Today, we walk through the Valley of the Kings and marvel at its beauty. We tour Karnak and Luxor and gasp at the carvings, the pillars, the sacred lakes. But beneath every stone lies a hidden scream. Every shadow contains the ghost of a life broken by pain. It is easy to praise the greatness of ancient Egypt, its architecture, its longevity, its mythos. But no empire, no dynasty is ever built without cost. And in Egypt's case, that cost was measured in bodies. Tens of thousands. Beaten, maimed, sacrificed in the name of eternal order. The pharaohs are gone. Their gods forgotten. But their legacy remains, not just in museums or textbooks, but in every civilization that followed. Their belief that fear could be a tool of order. Their use of pain as policy. Their willingness to torture, mutilate, and destroy in the name of divine control. These echoes have shaped the darkest corners of human history. From Roman arenas to medieval dungeons to modern dictatorships. The idea that power demands pain, that to control the many you must punish the few, began in places like Egypt, and its shadow still falls across our world. So next time you gaze upon a pyramid or marvel at a statue of a long-dead god-king, ask yourself, what hands built this? What screams echo through this stone? What price was paid for one man's glory? Because history is not just what survives, it is what was silenced. If this story gripped you, and you want to go deeper into the world's darkest histories, from the secret prisons of Stalin's Soviet Union to the medieval tortures hidden behind castle walls, make sure to watch our next episode. The Iron Crown and the Burning Throne, Medieval Europe's most brutal execution rites. Subscribe for more truths carved in pain, built on blood, and buried in silence. We tell the stories they tried to erase. We speak for the forgotten.